So we can call this meeting to order. Thank you, Mr. Glass, for being here today. Seeing no public, I think we can go on to our updates.
All right, I'll start. Chris will chime in and keep me honest and keep me up to date, as I may be a little behind on a few things. But first thing, obviously, we've done updates on the state school aid budget. You know, that's already said and done. We know that they'll be, coming into the fall here, and we're looking at revenue estimate conference. One thing I would note is Teresa's on the Governor's 21st Century Education Commission, and one of the three pillars of that is around funding and the funding formula. And they've certainly been focusing the conversation a little bit on best practices in states that are in the top 10. And Massachusetts is one that has a weighted funding formula that at least accounts for at-risk youth and high poverty. And again, no predictors, but certainly, we're hearing more and more talk about what the funding formula of the future should look like and how are we going to be particularly meeting the needs of those high poverty, high need students. So we're, cautiously optimistic. And the governor, we do believe, intends for his State of the State address to release the findings of the commission. From there, we would, possibly get a roadmap of what his potential budget could look, his proposal could look like.
That isn't public yet?
No.
Oh, okay.
Anything else to add, Glass?
Yeah, so there's going to be a lot we'll cover, and I'm sure we'll jump around a little bit, but this commission is running side by side with MDE's ESSA action teams. So that group is charged with coming up with Michigan-specific plan to access federal dollars. And then at the same time, Superintendent Whiston has a top 10 and 10 initiative to where there's aspects of that or components of that that are separate from what we're going to apply to the federal government to receive our federal funds through Title I, 2, 3, and 4. So you kind of got three things going at once. The way it's been described as the governor's proposal is seen as a little bit longer term than some of these immediate plans that MDE has moving forward with the ESSA and the top 10 and 10 initiative. But ideally, we're hoping everybody's communicating. We know that we have a consistent message with stakeholders, so hopefully some of that stuff starts to shine through in a more thorough way.
The adequacy study, is there any merit in getting kind of a summative review to the board or to this committee, I wonder?
Weren't you guys were you working on an analysis of that, or is that done to the superintendents already?
Yeah, so I've put together an initial analysis of that, and we can make sure the board has access to it. Really, the primary components that came out of that, and what makes this study different from other adequacy studies done, is we can't even really call it an adequacy study. And the reason why I say that is the RFP called for the firm to examine which districts in Michigan have above average performance, in which they use the state assessment on that. And then from there, they analyze how they're distributing their resources to get that performance. So from that perspective, an adequacy study says, how much does it take to get every child to the state's expectation? There was some equity analysis done in the adequacy study to where they said two things resoundingly. One, within their analysis, the districts that are above average, one thing that stuck out more than anything else was the incredible low need that those students had. Means low ELL, low at risk. Two, they came forward and they said that Michigan should fund ELL students at 40% weight above the foundation and at risk at a 30% weight above foundation. So those were the two big key topic areas, and I can keep going and talk about this a little bit, or we can
go for it.
One of the things that stood out to me in the analysis, and I've been telling stakeholders this, is it ties into our accountability system. We have an accountability system in the state that's blind to any student population for the most part. And yet we have a funding structure that inadequately funds the neediest students. And to me, that's a huge equity issue in and of itself. And so as we look at what we're doing for English language learners in particular, the state of Michigan, beyond bilingual education programs, of which GRPS has some, only provides $1.2 million for ELL students in our state. 1.2 million. And it funds a handful of programs, one of them GRPS is included, but there's still a lot of English language learner students who are not in those bilingual specific programs, who still have needs and supports that, this board is having to make decisions and shift funding to make sure you're meeting their needs.
For the whole state.
For the whole state, $1.2 million. And other states have found
we get
ways to
that title
get
money from
funding formulas in place that more closely reflect what the study recommended. For at-risk funding, statutorily, Section 31A, even though it had we're grateful for the increase that it provided, $90 million 2 years ago, it's still $90 million short of being fully funded, and it only provides 11.5% added increase on the foundation. And so 11.5 is far short of the 30% that the study called for as well. So those are just some aspects to where we're trying to get some awareness built for folks about these two issues. And we think there's some underserved populations out there that as a state, we haven't made the necessary investments to see the academic gains that we'd like to out of those students.
I think part of the encouraging news is that there's these 2-3 different things, and they're all kind of trending in a certain way that's largely favorable toward the conversation that we've been trying to have with your legislative platform about the need for more equity and adequacy in how we fund our schools, and making sure that that it's based on student need, not just on some geopolitical formula. House Bill 5194, this was the school year calendar, where in accordance with your legislative platform, there was advocacy for it to not be included as part of the prohibited subjects, or to be included as a prohibited subject. The only update there is that it's on third reading in the House. Anything new to report on your end, or is there do we anticipate? As I recall, this was where they were struggling to get the votes. That they're at least 8 votes shy on the Republican side, and the House Dem caucus is united against it.
Yeah, I would say that this number it's probably a little smaller than 8, but with the Detroit Public Schools legislative package, Representative Garcia had a huge role in that, and so it didn't allow her time and attention to focus on getting the votes necessary for the other one. I would say that from the perspective, it's a lot of just education for members. To help them understand that although it's not an issue for some districts, for other districts it is a concern, and that we need a policy that supports all districts getting towards the calendar that's in the best interest of students. So Representative Garcia has indicated she'd like to move that out of the House by the end of this year for sure.
And it was another one that got clouded a little bit because the pre-Labor Day school start was tied to it in committee. And so I think you had some lawmakers that were not making the differentiation between the two. So it created some confusion and some angst, but she managed to get the votes to get it out of committee. And it sounds like possible action here in the fall. Third grade reading, this is now in conference committee. House Bill 4822. It passed the House, passed the Senate. In the Senate, they did add a parental exemption for the retention and kind of further watered it down. As I recall, it takes 4 years now before it would kick in.
Correct.
The phase-in, if in the House was 3 years, this would be 4 years. They're now at conference committee.
Yeah, what's unusual about this is usually when you have a bill or a piece of legislation that's put to conference committee, they act on it fairly quickly, and this has not been acted on. I think one of the political realities of this situation is that the House passed it without a parent opt-out provision. The Senate added one in, and the reason the Senate was able to get support from its membership was because it included it. So they're going to have to decide through conference committee, how far they go with the parent opt-out provision, and then from there, it's strictly an up or down vote. There's no changes at that point. It goes if it receives enough support, it's passed. If it doesn't, then the whole entire legislative package dies. So it'll be interesting to see. They haven't had many conversations given the fact that they've been away for the summer, but how this conversation picks up. Part of it was, I think, some communication just between the Senate and the House with Representative Amanda Price leading this issue. The Senate kind of took it, put the parental opt-out in, and I don't know if there's a lot of communication back and forth between chambers. So this is a technique to force a little bit further conversation.
Their sinking fund, House Bill 4388, passed the House 107-1 and is now sitting in the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is something that we were particularly eager about because Senator Hildenbrand is friendly on this issue with us, and Senator Pavlo, who is the head of the Senate Education Committee, not so much. So I don't know if there's anything new there. I think we are anticipating action this fall. Senator Hildenbrand certainly aware of our position and our interests, and this has been a long-standing priority for the district. And last I heard, they were looking to take some action on it.
Yeah, so he'll be moving it from committee that first week of September, the first week that they have committee. Usually at that point, it only takes a week or two before a bill that's passed out of committee with substantial support will go to the floor of the second chamber and then be on its way to the governor. So we think this issue will be done and off the plate for lame duck, which is something that we've pushed for. We don't want it to get tangled up in other distractions, and so we're hopeful it'll get done prior to October being completed.
Social media requirement, Representative Zemke's bill, House Bill 4791. It is on the House floor now, and it's on second reading. I really haven't heard a whole lot more about this. I mean, it seems to be chugging along. Do you think it's going to get action?
It remains to be seen. I know, it is an election season, so Representative Zemke, being a Democrat, he's gotten a lot of issues and things brought up for attention, but these things are fickle this time of year. So it did not have the energy coming out of committee that I guess on the floor, it doesn't have the same energy that did coming out of the committee.
The Special Education Reform Task Force recommendations. These were Senate Bill 836 and Senate Bill 837. One is around positive behavior intervention support. The other one is around restricting restraint. That actually I don't have. Do you know where those are? Are they still in committee?
Yes.
Pending hearings?
Yep.
All right. This will be an issue that we're going to continue to monitor. We know it's a priority to the Lieutenant Governor. He has been personally seeing to the lobbying for this. And so these two bills are probably just the first in what may be a series of bills around special education reform. From what we can tell, a fair amount of which may be aligned with certainly some of the efforts that we've had here locally.
Mm-hmm.
Detroit Public Schools, the Senate, if you may recall, there was the House side and the Senate side. The Senate version, Senate Bill 710, which provided for the transfer to the proposed community district. This did pass the Senate and is now in a House of Approps. And then Senate Bill 111, which was the Financial Review Commission, is now passed by both the House and the Senate and signed into law. It's Public Act 195. The bills that we were most concerned with were on the House side, where they took kind of the Christmas tree of far out education reform, and that is on a second reading in the House. And I think you had the two competing proposals in the House and Senate. I haven't really heard anything new. What's your take, Chris?
Yeah, so the DPS proposal, they managed to come to some compromises on it, and it was signed into law. The biggest thing that they tackled was the debt. And so what you have now is for 10 years, the 18 mil non-renewal homestead will be used to pay down the debt, and the school aid fund will fully pay the per pupil allocation for every child in the Detroit Community Schools district. The tobacco settlement funds will backfill the school aid fund so that it's technically, the school aid fund will be held harmless. The biggest battle on this issue had to deal with the authority that would determine whether or not buildings could open and close and where enrollment would take place. That was not included in the final provision. There was an advisory committee that was kind of put in its place. The other thing is that there is a letter grade system that will be put in effect for accountability purposes for Detroit Public Schools. If the state makes a transition to a different accountability system with letter grades, then that would apply to the whole state. But for the purposes of Detroit Community Schools, it's only for that boundary.
So is the governance issue just still being debated, or is it just?
So they will have actually 60 people are vying for the school board seats. 60.
How many seats are there?
It's a full board election, so it's a brand new school board.
Yeah.
So the 7 members who will be elected, and 60 have applied to run for those 7 seats. And so it'll be interesting
Makes
to
your
see.
race seem a little more doable, Raynard. Although why we have 9? We have too many. 9 is crazy.
Yeah.
The package of bills to eliminate unnecessary and redundant reports and streamlining the reporting requirements did pass the Senate. 36-0 is in the House. Seems to be the darling of bills. This one kind of is not very controversial. Has some potential for election year politics.
I think we'll see movement on this in fairly short order. Basically, what it comes down to is school districts are asked to do a lot of reporting. Some of it is just mandates. And the question is what's being done with the data? And if it takes human, manpower, woman power, all of that to get that stuff done. And if it's not being utilized for any particular purpose, then let's take that burden off the local school district.
It's being collected on another report, and they're just not, they're making you do redundant reporting. So. Restorative practice, the House bills 5618 to 5621, they did pass the House 108-0. Our good friend David LeGrand has been working on this. It's in the Senate Judiciary. You might recall at one point there was a punitive approach where we had the potential to lose per pupil funding based on our suspension data. We have since worked to surgically fix that. Anything new on that you can think of?
No, we should expect to see some hearings on the Senate side on this. The fix that he's talking about has to deal with if you have a certain number of suspensions or expulsions, then you need to have a report put together on a district basis saying what steps or measures are you taking to address that. And that would make it so that you didn't have any funding that would be potentially taken away.
The last one, Chris, this is one for you to be in the hot seat. House Bill 5463 on coding.
Oh, dear.
No,
Forgot this was still going on.
This did pass the House and is in the Senate Education, but it is a slightly watered down version, as I recall.
Yeah, so I know this is.
We've been a long time coming on this.
Yeah, that's good. That's all right. I'll dust off the, so the legislation as introduced, and this has been, was kind of a national trend, at least bill introductions for it, and that was to say, can you count computer coding as a foreign language? The reality is most states, they started these conversations. Few of them, with counting computer coding as a foreign language, actually adopted it into law. By the time it got, and really what it was to say, how can we allow students the flexibility in what are typically constrained curriculum offerings that are requirements for you to get a high school degree, the flexibility to pursue their passions. And that's kind of how it all started. The legislation that John referenced, what it ended up doing was it ended up taking two current requirements in the Michigan Merit Curriculum and merging them together. And so a student could fulfill their visual, performing, or applied arts, which would be your CTE, which would be your band, your choir, any of those, as well as their world language requirement through any combination of those courses, and of which computer science would be included. And so if you were a world language superstar or that was something you were passionate and wanted to pursue, you could have 3 years of world language. All of that would count towards your core coursework for the Michigan Merit Curriculum, and that would free up flexibility elsewhere. If you knew you were passionate about some portion of the arts, you could pursue that. The same with career technical education, for students to be able to have more opportunity to have those courses. So we've begun conversations with the Senate. Really the important part that a lot of legislators have focused in on is that they didn't want any of the core offerings to be watered down. In the past, you've seen some conversations around the Algebra 2 requirement, your math, your science, your ELA, and your social studies. And so this is kind of that bucket that is outside of the core curriculum. And so there's been some interest in it beyond what other proposals have brought forward, because they do impede on that core curriculum component. So.
It's in the Senate.
Yeah.
Are we in?
Just to sort of summarize this committee's position, there was never any lack of sympathy for the value of coding or even making room within the curriculum for it. I mean, we were very sympathetic to that. There was just an agreement that should in no way be a substitution for foreign language requirement, that they weren't equivalent, and concern with watering down that requirement. So
That's really all I have, unless there's anything else, any other updates from a legislative standpoint?
No, I think that covers it.
Our next agenda item, I believe, is to talk about your legislative platform. And I thought it would just be good for us to kind of walk through this and just flip through page by page, and we'll kind of look at where I think we need some updates, where we can delete some things, and just get some feedback and direction from you so that I can work with Chris and Rusty, and we can prepare recommendations for you so we can bring it to the next committee meeting, and we'll get our legislative platform done for 2016, 2017. Good?
Yeah.
Getting a look, I'm not sure.
Okay.
On page 2, under guiding principles, I really don't see any reason to change this. For whatever reason, I thought that possibly switching the bullet point 2 up to number 1, just because that kind of starts to set, if you're reading them kind of in sequence, establishing Michigan as a top 10 state, and then how we do that is focusing on 3rd grade, 8th grade college readiness. So it's semantics. No one's going to know it was a change, but just as I read it through, I thought, man, it makes sense to maybe switch that up a little bit.
I'm wondering if we should reference the adequacy study and the other efforts going on towards
Well, under
equity
the-
and funding.
Yep, under the third to the bottom bullet point, where we talk about
Oh, yeah, I guess
Consistent
even when you
manner.
start, we focused on policy and appropriations, but yeah, okay.
Do we want to move that one out?
No, I mean, I didn't read through all of them, so.
So do you believe that that one covers it adequately, or do you want me to maybe put in parentheses adequacy study, 21st Century Commission, or is that?
I think this covers
you're
it,
good.
from my perspective at least. I mean, maybe the adequacy study.
Yeah, I just think, since this stuff's going on, whatever.
Well, and there may
I don't
be,
know who's gonna look at it, but.
maybe that's not under guiding principles when we get to the back
Yeah.
part here, we talk about the funding formula, that's, because we
Okay.
need to totally rewrite a portion of it, so let's hit the pause button, and then we'll come back to that and determine whether we want to do it on guiding principles or
Okay.
just in the
Yep,
body.
that's fine.
Legislative priorities, page 4, keep sinking fund, if anything, maybe just updating the bill numbers, there's just some of this little tweaks to it.
If that passes, when's it likely to, if that goes through,
The immediate effect.
October.
yeah,
So it'll take immediate effect, but the first time you would be able to ask the question on a ballot would be next May.
okay.
Third grade reading, this has been, again, maybe a few tweaks here and there, but this largely has been what's been our consistent position all along. And since this is now in conference committee, it's pretty far along. Depending, if and when they pass it, this is something that we'd check off the priority list. School calendar reform, same thing. I think we keep that as is.
So just on that, when you're updating, because these are kind of hot current things, and a couple of these might pass, this one might not. Do we keep the calendar on, even if it has a priority issue, and keep pressing on it?
If it's our priority issue, this is one of those, some of these issues have been on our priority list for 10 years. And
Yeah.
we just are now being, so I'd say we keep them on. I think you as a committee need to determine if there's priorities need to change.
Yeah.
These are our top legislative. You'll see when we get to the next couple pages, it shifts to just
When do
general.
we usually put this platform together?
We typically have it in advance of your legislative lunch. So,
Yeah.
right now, which we're going to talk about, but which is typically early December.
Yeah, so I'm almost wondering whether the prioritization might reflect some of the legislative activity that happens in the fall on some
We
level.
could wait to your November meeting to finalize it.
Yeah, okay.
And assuming that you want to go forward with either a December, or even Rusty was suggesting we could wait till after your board elections, wait till those new board members are sworn in to do the legislative lunch. We can always do the legislative lunch. We typically try to do one in the fall and one in the spring, but it gets a little redundant, so that was going to be the other thing I wanted to put, is do we really want to do two? Or is it, we do one for sure, and then we'll time whether or not we need a second one, and then instead, you do one legislative lunch here locally, and then we do our capital day.
That makes sense to me.
That's what I think too.
Yeah,
As much as we love them and they love come and see us, it's a good opportunity, to make best use of your time, their time, and our adequacy time.
I think it's good to wait for.
I did know.
It was very democratic of you.
Expanded ten, expanded tenure reform to include ancillary and itinerant support staff. I mean, this is a great example of something that may be of high priority to us as we try to implement a very comprehensive evaluation system. But this, right now is not on the docket it's not getting a lot of attention from the legislature. Next page, we have that kind of generic retirement reform language in there. I don't think, if anything, maybe I'll work with Rusty and Chris to see if there's any newer updated language, but by and large, we kept it pretty vague. If anything, Chris has got some new data that shows what a huge chunk of our per pupil dollars are that are going to pay for our retirement. What was the one you showed me? Was it like $2,000?
Yeah, so part of what I wanted to do with the finance study coming out is to be able to do an apples-to-apples comparison of how Michigan's funding its schools compared to other states. Michigan's one of the few states that actually funds its unfunded liability out of the foundation grant that the school districts receive, and it's 20.96% of payroll. And so when we take that number out, and so we still are accounting for current employees and what their retirement cost is, it brings the foundation level for GRPS down to about $6,100 per pupil. So you're 7,511 all the way down to 6,100, which is roughly 2001, 2002 funding levels. And at that time, there wasn't the unfunded liability, so all the dollars you received made its way into the classroom. And that's something that I just wanted to bring forward because in putting that context, I think it changes the conversation a little bit with legislators and other stakeholders to say, these are the resources we actually have to invest in educational programming for our students. Let's talk about that, and is that sufficient given the needs
But
and what the
muddied it when they
requirements are?
combined them. I mean, they had kept them separate.
Mhm. And that could be potentially, a policy recommendation.
School Aid Act rewrite, I think a lot of this language would stay the same, but again, we want to go through and update this. This is where I think we can add language in there about the adequacy study, about looking at what those other top 10 states are doing. I think this was probably a good place to insert that.
I just think that this might be more, we can wait till November with the new school board members and what happens legislatively, but it seems to me this is pretty hot topic. It might be more front page part of it, how we weigh in on that, because.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. Put this like right at the front. So that's the other thing is we can move these around, so when it's sitting on that
Yeah.
front page,
Yeah.
we know that we're going to be able to check off
I'll
few of
speak for
these.
everybody. Disagree or
No,
agree or
I would
whatever you
disagree
think,
if
yeah.
I did.
I know, I just want to make sure I'm not being a,
No, I'm good with
Okay.
that.
Charter school transparency and accountability. Again, we'll look through this a little bit more, but I think this is probably about the same as what we would keep it. Fair, full, permanent itinerant funding.
I think you're good there.
You think we're good here? All right. If anything, that was one, wasn't there an analysis that we were starting to question? In some years, we actually went, based on how much money they had in lapsed dollars, we were actually going to get more than what we would if it was the 28%. And so, if anything, we'll double check with with Haggerty and Larry Oberst and just make sure. If we're recommending this, it would be to our financial advantage. We do believe.
yeah. But you don't want to go by the year. In some ways, you want a sustainable fix.
Well, that's part
It
of.
feels
and-
like
and-
we're always like,
Well, and that's what the agreement we received from then, the House of Approps, said he's tired of dealing with the issue. They want to do a one-time fix and call it a day. And so I think that's what, they're going to be looking to us for what is that fix. And that's where we need to make sure we're consistent and have thought through. And I think that there is, there's a lot of conversation about how these services are provided. And, again, is that even something GRPS should be doing?
And the good news is from a budget standpoint, every year the budget for this had a reference that, this shall expire in this year. And so we'd have to fight each and every
Yeah.
year. Now that year reference is removed, and so we went through a whole cycle to where it just says, here's a $2 million cap for this fund to be
Oh.
paid. And what happens most of the time then is that language will stay in perpetuity, barring any reason to change it.
That's
So
new information. I didn't know that. Cool. How many other ISDs, school districts have this arrangement? Are we the only ones in the state, or are there?
we're
a couple
by far the largest. There's 5 total. Some are, very small. And it all has to deal with, right now, with our arrangement with itinerant staff, we allow the local districts to control that employee and be able to distribute them to meet their population needs. Other ISDs, basically their model is they hire them, they tell them where to go, and there's some inefficiencies with that model with spending, half a day here and 3/4 of a day there. Yeah.
My experience, having been an ISD special ed.
Yeah, sure.
Restoration, preservation of categorical funding. This is another one that I actually think we should look at merging this in with the funding side of it. Because, we're not necessarily opposed to looking at all the categoricals to be thrown into one pot, as long as the formula and how it gets redistributed. So it's,
I wonder politically too, whether to lose the term categorical,
right,
because
'cause it
that's got
sounds like it's-
baggage, and if you start looking at adequacy, that changes it. It doesn't feel like you're carving out categories instead.
The one thing I do like in here is that it shows the history of all the cuts.
Oh, yeah.
So if anything, maybe we tweak this a little bit to kind of show, like, obviously it points out the bilingual dollars were eliminated until just recently. And so, again, this is one of those, I think we need to look at this in the context of the rewrite of the school aid. Critical shortage list, we can check this one off. This one can come off completely. There is, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no sunset on the bill now, right? So they eliminated the sunset on the original legislation, and so right now, I think we're good to go. And if this ever pops back up on the radar, we will, we can always bring it back to your legislative platform. Educator evaluation. This is something, again, I don't see anything in here that really would change. This is pretty consistent with what our position's been. Same thing with the reform timing and mandates. I mean, this is where we do use that example where this points out an example of a mandate around the instructional days, as well as the elimination of the use of PD as part of instructional hours, which cost us money and it costs us time. And so I think there's a good example here. I'm not sure this is maybe where it fits. We may want to look at possibly updating this because of the package of legislation that talked about the duplication reporting requirements, streamlining of the reporting. I think there's something that we can do to update this a little bit. Page 8, early childhood. I don't think there's anything in here we'd change. I'll run it by Matthew Beresford, but this seems pretty consistent. Reforming the top to bottom list formula, same thing. I think that's something we'd keep. After-school programming, this is pretty generic language that we've had in there for a while. Standardized testing date. In fact, actually, I think this is something we can take out now because they have already made that switch. Common Core, this is language that talks about supporting the state fully funding and implementing the Common Core standards. The EAA, we think that this is important to keep in here, even though there's not a current threat for EAA codification in the sense that it was originally. However, because you have the state school reform office engaging much more in these priority schools, I think we may need to look at updating this language and maybe changing it so that it updates and accounts for the SRO. One of the things that was pretty interesting with the 21st Century Commission is, as Teresa and I put together this governance PowerPoint, Teresa's the chair of the governance committee, we went and looked at all the different layers of governance, from the feds to the state to the ISD to the local. And oh, by the way, there's also this SRO office that's just, one office over, right now, one school district essentially. And so I think we can build that in so that the language starts to head down a similar path that says we have a governance structure that's a little crazy, and you have these little one-offs like this, that's not even in MDE. They're under the Michigan Department of Technology Management and Budget.
Yeah.
Next page, ban open carry in schools. I think that's,
Let's keep that.
let's keep that. Restore dedicated school aid funding. This is another one where we need to update and merge it into one big funding. Consolidation of services. Again, I don't think there's a whole lot in here that we change. It's pretty generic language. And right now, there's not any new big push for consolidated services. The teacher administrator compensation. This is when there was a threat that they were going to, have it tied, their evaluation and performance much more closely tied to their compensation. Merit pay essentially is where it's headed. This does need to be updated. I don't know if House Bill 4625 is still a legislation, is it?
It is not, and actually, Students First closed its Michigan office, so they were the primary drivers of that piece of legislation.
So I think we ought to keep this. Maybe we can update it a little bit, just so that it's more current. Teacher effectiveness, parent notification and consent. This is the Scarlet Letter legislation that was out there. We think we ought to keep this. Right now, again, it doesn't seem like there's going to be any big push for legislative action.
Oh, all that Michelle Rhee stuff is just fading away.
School choice, same thing. I don't think there's anything in here. This is where the parent trigger legislation was coming out. All-day kindergarten. Rusty and I both think we ought to just keep this in here for historic purposes, because a lot of people don't realize that when they went to all-day K, we were utilizing Title I dollars to help support it. And so I'll talk with Chris and Rusty and see if there's anything else here, but I think it's important, shows that we support it, but how they fund it and the mandate for how it's provided, if we can still have that local flexibility to utilize those dollars like we are, that's what we want to maintain. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. The unfunded mandate, this has been.
That thing's been around
This has
forever.
been here since I started with the district.
Lisa Hinkle railing about it. The
If
Hadley
anything,
thing.
I think this could merge with the.
Funding.
Let's kind of work to get that out of there. School board elections.
I'm wondering, I'll be curious after this fall election, whether there's a little bit more noise and fallout on this, and whether we could get some movement in Lansing to actually fix this.
Well, this goes back a little bit to, again, the funding formula rewrite and how they're going to approach potential funding. It's not just the unfunded mandates, it's also.
Yeah, but this is really just, this was local, I'm talking about the school elections.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought
I'm
you were.
talking about the
back.
elections. No, I'm on to the elections.
I was going to suggest that we move this up to a priority.
Yeah. Okay, thank
Yep.
you. That's what I was saying.
Yep, that's
I just
what
think after this
Agreed.
fall election, there'll be a hue and cry across the state of to run for school board, it costs $25,000 and, it made it more partisan than ever and blah, blah, blah. And
When we talked about it at the commission,
Yeah.
This got the whole group stirred up when we started to explain the change in school board elections and how it happens mid-year, mid-superintendent evaluation. It's a mess. And talked about turnover of half the board potential. Yep,
Who did that?
partisan.
Who are those people? Do we have their names? Can we hold them
We
up
can
in
find them.
effigy?
We can find them.
It just seems so
It's
illogical
terrible.
to do
It's
in
just
the middle of the
awful.
school year.
Expanding dual enrollment and shared time services. This isn't one of them I wanted to talk with Chris and Rusty to see. Right now, I'm not familiar with what current barriers there are, what else we could do. We added this at one point when I think there was some move to potentially curtail some of the shared time services because
I'm in
it's
favor of
dollars.
cleaning up if it's really dated and it's not you know what I mean?
Yep.
The platform just is a little bit more current, yeah.
Personal property tax, I think we can take this out. I think we've already accomplished this. Christy, what do you think? Yep. Union dues, this is one that's always it's a perennial. It seems to pop up every 2 years, so keep it in there. Anti-bullying, this legislation is one that actually we could use as part of the social media requirement. You already have language that goes all the way to include the gender identity, gender, native language, and sexual orientation. So I think we'd keep that. Flexibility for vocational education, skilled trades. This is another one that we should probably just talk about how we update it, knowing that there's going to be an increased push on career tech, particularly even within our own district. The exempt from the Headley rollback, this is another one that's been literally as long as I can remember. So, I mean, this will be another one, maybe as we go through it with a fine tooth, we may recommend further cleaning up, but as of right now, it is
Should
what
be
it.
part of the funding.
And there might be an opportunity, we'll have to check. The reason why it was left this way was because we have the Headley Amendment in the state. And when they did Proposal A, they shift so much funding from the local level to the state level that they would have been over Headley. And so they left this little portion down here because it kept them under Headley. Well, now we're 9 billion under the Headley state limit. And so there's not even close to that much that's collected off the 18 mil. So if it's not a constitutional change, there might be some efficiency language that we can put out there to tell lawmakers, why spend the time and the energy to go after this when the state already recognizes that you're collecting that funding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jury selection, this is relatively new. We added this per the request of our good former Commissioner Paul Mayhew. And then lastly, federal issues. We can check this one off the
Yeah,
list. If
that's right.
anything, I think it's going to be more about regulations. So I think we can update this to talk about what our positions are as it relates to the implementation of ESSA. And then I would like to work with IRMA and the ELO network to try to understand a little bit more about the 21st Century Community Learning Centers and the funding for that. We can look at a few other, USDA and Food and Nutrition Services is another one that has seen some action at the federal level. But again, obviously, federal issues have not been the priority really of our advocacy.
Yeah, just for the board's edification, it would be great to get just what you said, some of the implementation issues, concerns.
Okay.
Maybe that can be like a post advocacy conference type thing, so, yeah.
Unless it gets snowed out again.
Yeah.
All right, and that's it. We'll make these, we'll work on a draft and start to update this. It sounds like you've all kind of answered the last question where it was around our Capitol Day, I believe. Legislative luncheon. We were thinking maybe first week in December. First or second week in December. We had a pretty good turnout before. Or we can wait till after your new board members are sworn in and do it in like January, February. At that point, we'll have a better idea of what the budget might look like. So we would do like a
Yeah, and
February,
the new
January.
legislators are sworn in too.
Right. So
It'll be
February,
post lame duck, it'll be,
do we
you know,
do it post State of the State?
what is that?
20th?
Usually it's the end of January, yeah.
End of January. And and the budget recommendations typically come out
First week of February.
first week of February. So
Yeah, probably
maybe we
February.
look at the second week or third week in February, and then we do our Capitol Day again in like April, May.
Sounds good.
That allows you for the hand-to-hand combat for lame duck conversations as opposed to.
Yeah. Right.
That's right.
That's what it takes too. I'll take your first board if you do this.
I only got one, don't take them.
And I think that's it. If you don't have any other questions.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.